right, everybody, thanks for coming out. We packed the room again. That's a great problem to have. My name's David Fisher. It's my honor to be the co-chairman of the Ron Paul campaign here in Iowa. I grew up going to Old Thresher, so it's always great to be back in Mount Pleasant, where I'm at every Labor Day weekend, as a matter of fact. But we're thrilled to have this kind of crowd turned out today. I'm one of 17 elected members of the Republican Party of Iowa State Central Committee. That's the governing board of the Iowa GOP. 5 of the 17 of us have endorsed Ron Paul for president. That's 4 more than any other candidate. There's been some pretty exciting things going on in the polls that you might have seen. Congressman Paul's moving up right at the top of the pack now in all the latest polls. The other thing these polls tell us is that Iowans see Ron Paul as the most principled and the most fiscally responsible candidate in the race. Now, does that sound like something America needs right now? All right, so allow me to introduce the 12th-term congressman from Texas, the champion of the Constitution, Dr. Ron Paul.
Before I get started, I want to introduce 2 members of my family. I'm with me, 2 granddaughters, 4 sisters. That's Lisa and Linda. We actually had our Christmas a little early this year, last weekend, because our older sister, who's getting ready to graduate from medical school, just got married. So we had a big family there. And Linda is in A&M, getting ready to go to veterinary school, and Lisa's in medical school too. But anyway, I'm glad to have them with me today. But it is a real delight to be here. Did anybody get to watch the Jay Leno show this week? I'd been on his show a couple of times before, and it was always nice. He's a real gentleman, and sometimes he allows me to deliver the end of my sentences like some other people don't. But it went well, and evidently he got a whole lot of comments. In fact, on my way in, he called me on my phone. And he wanted to thank me for it. He said that they got a lot of very favorable responses, and he says he thinks there's a pretty good chance they're just going to replay that program again. We did get a lot of responses, and it is true. He asked very similar questions that others asked in a very negative fashion. Like they ask you a question, and then they quickly cut you off and not allow you to finish your sentence. At least on that show, we got to explain ourselves. And usually when people understand in a little more depth about the economic policies I talked about, the monetary policy, and the Federal Reserve, and even the foreign policy, and even the principles of liberty and why we should follow the Constitution, people usually do not think, that makes sense. It's not that complicated. It's just common sense. I don't think economics is complicated. I think economics is complicated if you study it in college. They really made it complicated because they're always trying to justify why you need government to tell you what to do with your dollars and how to spend them and how you invest and everything else. But most people out of common sense, especially with the traditions of America, we were taught if you work hard, save and invest, you can provide for yourself and save yourself a nest egg. When you have government doing the planning, they think that savings is bad. You're supposed to spend money and stimulate the economy. You're supposed to have the government spend the money, and then they tax you and interfere with all your choices. So there's a big difference. There's a big difference between the economics of the Keynesians and liberalism, where they take over, versus free market Austrian economics, where the market handles things. People do make voluntary choices. I am convinced that the problems that we face today is that we, many years ago, gave up on market principles. And it really got going in the wrong direction during the Depression, because the conclusion of the Depression was that was when they were ushering in the age of Keynesianism. They said that freedom was the fault, free markets were at fault, property rights were at fault, and that stupid gold standard was at fault. And therefore, government had to take control. They had to direct the investments and decide what interest rates should be, and they should be spending the money, and they have no of these obligations. And in many ways, we've been slipping ever since then. Some people would argue that's not the case. We've had some pretty good years since the Depression. We've had ups and downs, but pretty good years. But what we have drifted from is prosperity, where prosperity is paid for, versus the superficial prosperity that our country has today, which is built on debt. Our government is really insolvent. They can't pay bills. Tragically, they've taken the Social Security Trust Fund and they removed the word trust, and the fund is no longer there. And they have IOUs in the so-called trust fund, which means to pay out the beneficiaries, they have to tax somebody else or print the money in order to send out the checks, because there's no real welfare. If an insurance company would run their trust funds the way the government has run the Social Security Trust Fund, they don't go to prison, because it's fraud. And I think we lose twice when we go in that direction. First, they undermine the principle of promising to pay out Social Security, or if they just tax you and the government spends it. But what they do with it is harmful. First, taking it is wrong, but the second part is what they do with it. And this is the problem that we face today, because many, many decades now, especially since World War II, every year we spend more and more money overseas. We spend it on foreign aid, intervention, propping up dictators, fighting wars that we don't need to be fighting, and they drain these reserve funds. They drain the Social Security, so that money has been spent. So my proposal in the budget I propose is to reverse that in order to try to prop up funding that now we can't afford, we don't have the money, is start reversing the expenditures overseas. And that is the reason I've offered a program we would cut $1 trillion the first year. One half of it would come from overseas spending, and that would mean, though, that we as a people would have to change our attitude about what our foreign policy should be. So I've talked a lot about it. I get a lot of criticism for it, but really it's not brand new. It was one time Republicans advocated, minding our own business and having a strong national event. Matter of fact, not too long ago, the year 2000, when Republicans won the White House and the House and the Senate, the foreign policy that George Bush ran on was no more nation building, no more policing of the world. Don't get involved in these internal affairs. So it is popular with the people, but right now, the proposals being made by our campaign and my efforts is just to reinstate what the Constitution says and come back to a little bit of sanity and say, no more wars unless you declare them and fight them and win them and get them over with. But this perpetual war is bankrupting our country.